Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this morning's FDA webinar. And this morning, I'm delighted to be joined by Roxanne Selby from our export service provider member, White and Black. Roxanne's going to be giving us a bit of a deep dive into agency and distributor agreements this morning, including lots of practical tips. And I believe there's quite a lot of content to get through, so I'm going to hand over quite quickly to Roxanne. Just to let you know, the webinar has been recorded, so the recording will be sent around afterwards and you can share that with your teams. And Roxanne has provided a summary of her slides as well, which we'll send around in the email along with her contact details should you have any questions. If you do have any questions, then you can pop them in the chat box or ask or take your camera off and come off mute at the end and ask Roxanne the questions at the end if we've got some time. I think we should have a bit of time at the end. So I'm just going to hand over to Roxanne and start sharing her presentation. So just give me 1 second. Right, hopefully everybody can see that okay.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you so much for having me here to talk to you today. Really pleased to join you. Very excited to join this FDA webinar. Just by way of background very quickly, I'm a solicitor, I'm at White and Black. I am tending to work more on the litigious side, so often I'm seeing potential disputes or disputes with agency and distributor type agreements, but my focus is very much on helping our clients grow their businesses through using these types of agreements and focus on helping them navigate at sort of any potential pitfalls and risks. So that's where I'm coming from. So just today, we're going to focus on some of the key things that you as exporters or perhaps potential exporters, I know we've got a range of people online today, so some of the things you need to think about when you're considering how recruiting or managing an agent might help you grow your business. I'm aware that obviously agents are really useful in the food and drink sector, just given some of the unique characteristics and difficulties of the industry, and also some of the recent challenges that there have been about exporting, which seem to be sort of improving now. So just to flick through what we're going to talk about first, we thought we'd begin by looking at why you might appoint an agent, why you might look at an agent versus a distributor type arrangement. There are advantages and disadvantages of both, and it's worth considering what's going to best help your interests. Some of the key things around the structure of agency agreements, around commission structures, how you terminate agreements, which I know seems very gloomy at this point, perhaps where you're thinking of an arrangement or you've got them in place already, but is really important to think about early, and also the impact of the commercial agents regulations, obviously 1993. And we're going to finish with a few sort of key practical tips and things to think about. So just moving on. As to why we might appoint an agent. So there are a number of, I'll just move the slide on. There are a number of fantastic advantages really to appointing agents, especially in this sector. And as we touched on before, I think some of the commercial dynamics and the regulatory landscape around things like labelling, food and drink regulations make them really well suited. Obviously, you can use them to access markets faster than you might otherwise be able to do so if you're looking at entering the market yourself, or maybe you'd need a presence. And there's lower entry costs and sort of less risk, but crucially, you can keep control much more of your brand. You're much more in control of how your brand is presented and marketed. Often we find when we're dealing with this area that agents will have fantastic existing relationships with retailers or wholesalers, perhaps large hospitality businesses. So they can be a great way of helping you accelerate visibility in the market. They come to you with local knowledge. It might be about the consumer preferences in a particular country or region, pricing strategies, what will work, what won't work. and any regulatory requirements. So things like about any particular labelling requirements in that country, safety requirements, any import restrictions, those kind of factors, they can be incredibly well placed to help you with. They're also a great way to avoid some of the kind of initial costs and risks if you've not previously had this kind of relationship or you've not sold into a territory. So, you know, if you were to do that yourself, obviously you might require premises, you might require staff with local knowledge or legal setup. Or if you had a distributor instead, you might need to provide them with a large amount of your product that could have a sort of initial impact in costs. This model is a sort of different model where the agent is negotiating contracts on your behalf. So you pay them commission, and this can be a much lower risk and cost effective way of operating. And as I've said before, really, because the agent is acting on behalf of you, you can retain a lot of the control around brand messaging, control of the customer relationships, and those sorts of factors that can be really, really important in the where you have the sort of product that's a brand that's really important to protect how it's dealt with. We talk a lot about the Commercial Agents Council Directive Regulations 1993. I know there was talk about getting rid of these recently, but it looks like they're here to stay. We talk about them a lot in a really kind of negative way about all the restrictions and obligations that they impose on people. You know, and who applies to them, as if it's a disadvantage, but actually sometimes that can be a helpful mechanism. It gives you a sort of a legal framework that even if it does provide protection for agents that might in some ways be perceived as negative to you as an exporter, it can help reduce any sort of ambiguity and risk around things. Sometimes where we've seen people where they've got either less than perfect or no contracts, you know, they can provide a sort of helpful way to clarify the end of a relationship or that sort of thing. So they're not all negative, and it's worth sort of considering that. So moving on, just to the next slide. We've started already to think about some of the characteristics of agents, and a lot of the time, whether you want an agent or a distributor, depends on your business priorities. Obviously, this is a commercial question rather than a specifically legal one in lots of ways, and it might depend on where your business is in its lifespan. You know, if you're very new, if you're expanding, established, and sometimes those relationships and the relationships that you need might change as you become a different type of business, really. The key thing legally, from my point of view, is that there is a really important legal distinction between the agent and the distributor, and that's really important to factor in, and for a number of reasons. So in the agency relationship, the agent will enter into negotiations, and depending on where you're going, sort of conclude contracts between you and customers. So the contract there is between you and the customer. The title or the ownership of the goods does not pass to the agent. You also retain control of your product, of the pricing, the marketing, customer relationships. You pay the agent commission, which again can be quite a cost-efficient way of expanding. Distributors can be fantastic as well, and you know, I see disputes with both. I see the positives and negatives of both. But legally, obviously, there's a big difference with a distributor in that when you use a distributor, you're selling the goods directly to them. You're transferring the title or the ownership of the goods to somebody else who's going to then sell them on your behalf. They will make a margin on those goods. You've effectively just sold them the stock. And that can be a great way of doing business as well. It can be really simple, and it can also make them very motivated to sell. You know, if they don't sell it, they might be stuck with a load of stock, which can be an absolute nightmare. And I know certainly recently we seem to have had a spate of distributor agreements that have been ended or going wrong, where, you know, stock and long tail stock has been in some areas a real issue. So that's worth bearing in mind. Likewise, a distributor might help offer you really good reach, you know, into new markets, But I think crucially, the difference is that if managing your brand is really important to you, you've got much less control over that. They can price, with a margin as they want. Obviously you can control certain amounts in agreements with them as well, right? But generally, you've got much less control. There are differences, again, between distributors and agents in the consequences of termination. I'm going to look at this a little bit more later on, but I've already flagged that, if you have a distributor, you don't fall under the commercial agency regulations, so you don't have the same position on termination. With an agent, you do have a position on termination, which can be difficult. If the agency falls under the regulations, if you wish to terminate it, you may have to pay either compensation or indemnity, depending on the sort of position that you're in. So moving on, I wanted to look at some of the key features of agency agreements. Oops, I've gone too far. How can I go back? So there we are. Thank you very much. So just wanted to look at some of the types of agreements that people enter into and the arrangements they enter into. So first of all, a sort of key consideration in these kind of agreements, and it's an area that does come up surprisingly often as problematic, is the type of agent that you want to appoint. It's really important to sort of think about this, put it carefully into an agreement, because we do see areas where, people are saying, oh, I'm an exclusive agent, and maybe the principal or the exporter thinks they're not, or, and where the arrangement is unclear, and where people don't really understand the differences. There are differences that are important differences between exclusive, sole, and non-exclusive agents. Where we see disputes, it's often due to lack of clear contracts, or that things have changed further on. And so understanding what they mean and what the implication is for you as an exporter is really key. The key difference really is the level of exclusivity and the rights that you retain. I've grouped them into sole, exclusive, and non-exclusive. And although these are sort of three broad definitions, there isn't really a universally accepted definition. So putting in an agreement exactly what the rights and restrictions are is really important. The first one is exclusive. In this scenario, it's going to be your only way of entering and selling into the territory. You can't appoint any other agents in that territory, and potentially any distributors as well in that territory, depending on what your agreement says. It also means that you yourself cannot make any sales in the territory, and that's an area that does come up quite a lot. You can reserve certain rights. So sometimes we get situations where an exporter wants to supply certain classes or customers, certain classes of customers directly. And again, if you want to do that, that can be done, but you need to be really clear about it in any agreement. For a sole agent, you're appointing the agent as the sole agent for the territory, but it might mean that you yourself can sell in that territory as well. So you retain that right there. It's often something people want, perhaps when they want an agent to dip their toe into a country, but they're thinking that longer term they might want to set up something themselves there, or they might want to sell as well. They perhaps already have abilities to do that, and they just want the agent to extend their reach. So again, it's worth thinking about that. And then non-exclusive. In this scenario, you're appointing the agent, but you know that you might want other agents in that country or territory as well. You might want to sell yourself. And there are also implications if you do have multiple agents on the way that you manage that. For example, sometimes you can get scenarios where sales are made and that two agents can say they have the right to commission. Again, you need to be really clear about how you deal that sort of thing. Something I've not put on this slide, but which also comes up quite a lot, is the issue of subcontracting. We have seen disputes and situations where things have been going really well, and then an agent has decided to subcontract work or part of a territory or something like that to somebody else. Sometimes maybe they've not been allowed to do that under the contract, but they've done it anyway, and things have been okay at the time. So the business hasn't objected, and then things have gone wrong. Maybe they've not made the sales, or maybe you didn't want it in the first place. So I think being very, very clear about if that's allowed or not, and when that's allowed, is really, really important. So moving on now to a couple more key elements. So there are a few other factors that I think it's really important to think about when you're looking at agency agreements. It's surprising, we've talked about exclusivity, but it's really surprising to me sometimes how often people do not consider exactly what they're selling or where. You need to be really clear on the scope of the agent's obligations. Where is the territory that they're covering? I saw an agency agreement a few years back that divided England into different regions, but didn't specify exactly how those regions were set up, which was a bit of a nightmare and not very clear. And you also need to make clear whether they're selling all your products throughout the territory, some of them, or what is the scope of what they're doing. Likewise, how long are they going to do this for? Again, length ties in with some of the factors that we've talked about and will be talking about in relation to the commercial agents regulations. You might want to balance, if you're appointing somebody new, giving an agent long enough to build up their role with your ability to get rid of them in a sort of cost efficient way. And that's thinking about some of the provisions at the end of the relationship for compensation or indemnity. Likewise, thinking about how you manage that relationship and how you track that it's working for you. Sometimes we see situations where people are not happy with relationships, but they've not quite got the paperwork to sort of work out, whether it's something they can terminate for really poor performance or not. They've perhaps not got the reporting in place. So, having provisions for requiring particular forms of reporting so that you can track how things are going, you've got proper record keeping, can be really, really helpful in tracking progress, deciding if the relationship's working for you. And also, in the event that you do need to terminate, if you've got the decent paperwork, it's much easier to sort of to do that without causing any messiness. You can also head off, obviously, any issues with payment if you've got everything properly documented and all in order. Likewise, you do need to think about how you will manage commission entitlement. What will you pay? How will you handle any issues about it? What if there are sort of disputes about what an agent's entitled to? So it's important to think about those sorts of things. I know it sounds really gloomy, and it probably comes from my background dealing with so many disputes, but I do think it is really helpful to think before you even get into an arrangement about what the end point might be or what the longer term future might be. Thinking about notice provisions, termination clauses, what might happen after termination, any restrictions that you need is really, really important, just to keep things nice and tidy. So you might need to think about things like what happens to any of your confidential information in the event that the arrangement ends. What about anything that you shared that's commercially sensitive? And this is sort of in addition to any potential termination costs that you might come up against. And also worth bearing in mind as part of that is if your agency falls under the commercial agents regulations, as a lot will, you cannot contract out of certain rights, including like the right to compensation or indemnity in certain circumstances on termination. So just to move on slightly, I wanted to briefly consider commission and commission structures. Again, this is really a commercial question for you guys rather than a legal question for somebody like me or my colleagues drafting agreements. But the main thing I would urge is, do put an agreement in do put your agreement into a proper contract that's looked at by somebody sensible. And by somebody sensible, I mean somebody who really understands what you want to achieve and will look at that critically and help you work out if there are any areas that are going to cause you problems down the line. In terms of commission structures, there's a lot you can do. We often see agency agreements which are percentage based. The commission might be between sort of 5 and 15%, but people do set up agreements in different ways. Most usually, it might be net sales, gross sales. Sometimes commission is based on orders secured. Sometimes it's based on payments made, which obviously can mean less risk to you as you've actually got the money before you're paying out. Likewise, commission rates can be flat, but sometimes people like to make those performance-based or tiered, or to include bonuses for securing new accounts or markets. You might want retainers plus commission. All of that's absolutely fine and something for you to decide, as long as really you need to make sure that you've got clear documentation on all of that. Again, when you're sort of devising these kinds of commission structures, you might want to consider other things around how the agency is going to work. It can be appropriate sometimes for you to have a different level of commission where an agent has got an exclusive or a non-exclusive agency. You might want to give an exclusive agent a higher rate of commission to give them more incentivization to focus on that territory when you've got no other way of selling into that area. But if you have more agents, you might want to pay less commission because you can appoint more other people. But you might want to factor in other things such as the risk of double commission payments if you end up with agents in the same transaction that I mentioned before. Again, you do need to be aware, going back to the commercial agents regs, of entitlement for commission on transactions that are concluded during the agency afterwards. So all of this you need to think about when you're at the start of a relationship or whatever. So moving on, obviously termination is a key area that comes up a lot again. I hate being the depressing person who goes on about termination when you're looking to begin a great relationship, or maybe you're in the middle of a great relationship. But I think understanding termination and your obligations on termination is really, really important. And also thinking about it up front. How will you get out of any agreement if it's not working for you? What happens if you want to change your strategy? What happens if you want to move to a distributor model or to distribute yourself? So you've got to think about those factors. I think I've just gone too far on the slide, so I just need to go back one. So there are different ways in which you can terminate and different reasons for terminating. And the key thing is to make sure that you have an agreement with a key termination, with a clear termination clause and provisions. And you need to review any clauses carefully and really think about this. If it's silent on certain issues, you might fall under the statutory protections under the regulations. Or if you're in a sort of agency that doesn't fall under the regs, you can sometimes fall into a bit of a grey area where you get into questions of what constitutes reasonable notice, based on the length of the contract, the financial dependence of the agent, commitments at the time of termination. I recently settled a dispute for somebody who'd been in a relationship for 105 years. And obviously that one fell outside. It was a different kind of arrangement, but obviously with that, what constitutes reasonable notice is a big issue. So what you need to look for is provisions for you to terminate with and without cause. It might be you just want to end the agreement, you want to do something else, and a contract needs to contain the provisions for you to do this, factoring in obviously any minimum notice provisions, etc. How you do it, how you terminate without cause and when you can do so may depend on how your agreement is set up and structured. So, often people will have a fixed term kind of agreement. Often you can't terminate those early and, without cause unless the contract provides expressly for it. It might provide for a kind of specified minimum term after which you can terminate. with notice, and that might factor in things like the agent needs time to recover their investment in the agency. For an agreement that's kind of a rolling on one or of an indefinite duration, you'd tend to have a provision for giving notice for any sort of just you want to end it. But obviously without cause, you need to comply with minimum notice periods if you fall under the regulations. Just by way of an aside, really, there are certain limited circumstances when an agency may be irrevocable. I can't say it, I'm struggling. That's if the agency was granted for consideration and protects an independent interest of the agent, but that's really, really rare, so not generally something to worry about. There are also situations where you need to provide for termination to occur automatically. So on expiry, on bankruptcy of the agent, death of the agent, I've seen death. Insanity I've never seen, but I look forward to that one. You also want any contract to be really, really clear on when you can terminate on cause. Typically, if the agent is absolutely useless and you want to just bin them off and get rid of them, you need to have a provision that enables you to do that. Often it will be kind of material breach. So you'll want to be able to terminate the agreement if the agent breaches a really fundamental term of it. It's often expressly provided for in the contract. So it might be that it's a failure to meet certain minimum sales targets or other key obligations. And sometimes you get into a bit of a disagreement about that, but that's one that commonly comes up. And such breaches may be treated as what's called a sort of repudiatory breach that goes to the heart of the contract, and it might allow you to terminate without any liability for compensation or indemnity under the regs. I mean, again, this depends on the specific nature of the breach. It depends on the circumstances. And I would absolutely urge you to get sensible advice if you're thinking of terminating because you think the agent is useless. Because what you do not want is to be, to get it wrong, make a mess of it, and be exposed to claims which can be expensive and difficult. And it's just a nightmare for everyone when you want to focus on growing your business and the sort of positive future. There are often termination clauses in agreements which will allow you to terminate if there are repeated breaches of the agent, even if they're not sort of quite as serious or material. And you also need to look carefully at these termination clauses. Sometimes even where you're terminating for some kind of material breach, they might provide for you to give notice and sometimes give the agent time to remedy that breach. So sometimes you see 28 days or something like that, and you would be expected to give them notice, follow the procedure in the event that you want to terminate. And a lot of people do get that wrong. They just want to rush straight in and they don't follow the procedure, and that can be an area that can be difficult for people. After you terminate, it's also worth thinking about that even after you terminate, there can be situations where an agent may still have a sort of apparent authority in the eyes of third parties. They could end up binding you into agreements. So it can be wise when you terminate to discuss your strategy for that termination and exiting them. Sometimes it can be wise to give notice of termination to third parties to avoid these kinds of unauthorized actions or difficulties. So that's worth thinking about as well. Just looking a little bit more at the notice periods. Oops, gone too far. Have we? There we are. Oh no, there. Sorry. As I've mentioned before, you need to beware about notice periods and what happens to the agent on termination. You need to also be careful because there's an obligation, particularly in the regulations, to act in good faith, which means you need to act honestly and fairly in the way that you deal with your contracts. I think Regulation 15 of the regulations provides the minimum statutory notice periods. If there isn't one specifically in your contract, that provides for 1 month in the first year, 2 months in the second year, and 3 months in the third year. And this has to be in writing unless it's otherwise agreed. You can contract for obviously longer notice periods, and that can be helpful in situations where there's a bit of a lead time or something like that, but not for less time. And I would say also we have had a couple of situations recently where people have put in longer notice periods into agency agreements, and I would be aware of that. We've had a situation recently where people then want to negotiate down that period, perhaps as a sort of prelude to termination. Reducing the notice period unilaterally could cause a sort of problem for you. It could lead to a claim for breach of contract. It could expose you to claims for damages, in addition to sort of claims for any compensation or indemnity under the regs, although the courts in England and Wales generally don't allow any double recovery, so recovering the same amount twice. So the other thing to be aware of under the regulations is that the notice period must expire at the end of a calendar month. So make sure you're just a little bit careful on dates and that sort of thing. Also, beware of doing things like reducing notice periods and terminating straight after. This can harm sort of your reputation. It may harm relationships with other agents. It may be perceived as unfair, opportunistic, or acting in bad faith. If you try and negotiate down the notice period and then you suddenly terminate, that might be viewed quite negatively and might also raise questions about the way in which you varied the agreement. And again, varying an agreement is something you have to be careful about as well. And as stated before as well, in agreements covered by the regulations, you have to remember and factor in from the start that on termination, agents are entitled to either the compensation or indemnity, assuming that you're not terminating for material breach. It can be quite tricky calculating the compensation or the indemnity under the regulations, and it's quite important to think about. Compensation tends to be the default option under the regulations unless you've explicitly chosen indemnity. The courts, if there's any sort of dispute, would favour compensation in a dispute unless and it's important to think about the characteristics of that compensation. Crucially, compensation isn't capped, which can obviously have a big impact on you if you're looking to terminate an agreement that has compensation provided for. That compensation is based on the loss of the value of the agency. So, the amount that a hypothetical purchaser would pay for the agency at the date of termination. As a result of that, it can be really favourable to agents. So you've got to be aware of it, especially where the agency has a significant value or where the agent has perhaps incurred costs that have not been amortized and which might be quite significant. So yeah, to calculate the compensation, you need to assess the damage suffered by the agent at the termination date due to the termination. So, you're depriving the agents of commission they would otherwise have earned through performing the contract while they're providing you with a benefit, or where this termination prevents the agent from amortizing costs and expenses that they've incurred. And there's a lot of case law on this as well, so it is important to try and get this right. If an indemnity applies, the agreement must state that an indemnity applies, and that's really, really important as well. Indemnity, it sounds really alarming, but it can sometimes be quite helpful in terms of providing a clarity as to what you're going to pay. For the indemnity calculation, the agent must meet 3 conditions. 1, they must have brought in new customers or significantly increased your business with the existing customers. 2, you as a principal must continue to derive substantial benefit from those customers. So, you have to be continuing to make sales through them, etc. And 3, the payment of the indemnity must be equitable, particularly thinking about the commission that's been lost by the agent on the principal's business with the customers. So in terms of the calculation for the indemnity, it's based on the commission that the agents earned over the last 12 months in respect of new customers and increased business with existing customers. You've got to exclude certain elements, so fees for debt collection, deductions for expenses, and also factor in stuff like the cash flow advantage that they would receive it in a lump sum. And Regulation 17 sets out really guidance on how to do this. So you assess the value to you of the new or increased business they brought in. You consider whether the payment's equitable, and crucially, you cap the payment at a maximum of 1 year's average remuneration. And that includes all forms of payment, not just the commission, over the previous 5 years or the full period of the agency if it's less than 5 years. So, you know, that's there's quite a calculation involved in that. What you often get is sort of debates or disputes about whose business is new, whose business is increased, and that sort of thing. So it's not totally straightforward, but it's the capped sort of thing can be appealing to sort of exporters and principals, because you've got certain clear conditions on that can limit what you have to pay out to an agent afterwards. Again, there are specific situations where an agent cannot claim an indemnity. So where the principal terminates due to repudiatory breach, or where the agent terminates at will unless they're justified by prescribed circumstances, or where the agent assigns the agreement with your consent. And they can't sort of you can't sort of opt to use the indemnity if the agency agreement doesn't fall within the scope of the regs. And you can't also exclude or reduce the right to an indemnity before the agreement expires. So I have seen situations where people have attempted to exclude that and to say that the agent won't claim it and that sort of thing. You can't do that. And also you have to settle an agent's claim. You can only finalise it after the agreement has terminated. And likewise, the agent must notify the principal within a year of termination if they intend to claim that indemnity or compensation. Otherwise, they lose their entitlement for that. So just moving on, we've talked quite a bit about the commercial agents regulations already. I just wanted to flag a couple of points in a bit more detail. Oh, the problems was the slide. Yes, thank you. So there is a definition of a commercial agent under Regulation 2.1. They're described as a self-employed intermediary with continuing authority to negotiate or conclude the sale or purchase of goods on behalf of another person. It doesn't apply to agents who are negotiating services or employer-employee relationships, or to agents who are contracting in their own name. So that does go back to the sort of point I mentioned earlier on about the legal structure. If they apply, you need to look at, is the agent involved in the sale or purchase of goods? Does the agreement fall within a territorial extent, and do any exclusions apply? In terms of territorial extent, the regulations apply to activities carried out in England, Scotland and Wales, and where both the agent and the principal are in the UK, it's absolutely straightforward. Obviously here we're looking to export, and you can get complexities in certain cross-border situations. Assuming you have a contract under English law, if the agent's activities are in the EU, but the governing law of the agency agreement is English law, the regs will apply then, as long as the EU member states law corresponding to the regs allows the parties to choose English law. So generally, if you're exporting to the EU, the regs will apply typically. They may still apply if there are certain non-EEA countries. It depends. But if you're looking at other countries, you need to think about advice, so e.g. wider export markets, India, places like that. Where the regulations do apply, you cannot contract out of certain of the regulations as discussed, and there are key provisions, that apply then. So you've got the sort of the duties set out in regulations 3 and 4, entitlement to commission, obviously the notice points, and then the compensation and indemnity. And be aware that that can lead to cost exposure, especially if agents have built up goodwill and relationships. So you are obliged to have at least a minimum notice provision. And you're obliged to act in good faith as well, and beware of the post-termination commission. So finally, I wanted to just look at a couple of the key practical questions and considerations. So I've just summarised some of the absolute key points here. Again, thinking about the relationship and what it looks like at the end, at the start, can be really helpful. Would you like greater certainty of an indemnity? Would you be happy with compensation? Are the notice periods in the regulations long enough for you? Do you have the right legal support in place? Do you have, you need support really in some of the key areas that we've talked about today. There can be particular difficulties around varying agreements, around terminating them, around some of the potential risks that may come up. And I think that's important. I mean, I'm not trying to sell my own services, but you know, that there are a load of potential nightmares here if you don't get it right. So it is important to think about, and it's cheaper to do it up front than to end up in litigation further down the line. And finally, a key practical tip is to keep really, really good records. So especially of any obligations, records around performance, customers introduce, key instructions, key decisions. What you want is to be in a position to manage and head off any commission claims or any disputes around performance, and make it really easy if you do need to terminate for poor performance. So just in conclusion then, in summary, our key takeaways are really that agency agreements are fantastic. They're a great way to enter new markets while keeping control. But you have to be super aware of the potential for the commercial agents regulations to impact on you, and about what that means for you and for your business. And finally, I would say enter into decent contracts, because that saves you a heck of a lot of grief further on. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Roxanne. That was very insightful. I'm just going to quickly, I'm just aware we're running out of time, but if anybody does have any questions they would like to raise, if you want to take yourself off mute and just ask away, or pop your hand up. I've just got one question. I've just got one question for you, Roxanne, that came in prior to the meeting. I'm thinking of appointing an agent to help me expand into a new country. I'm keen to get the relationship right from the start. Are there any areas which people often get wrong? Yeah, so any sort of pitfalls, things to think about.
Well,
Great.
I mean, there are lots of pitfalls, aren't there? I think not agreeing clearly the terms of the agency relationship would be one. An area we've actually not touched on much today is that of sort of due diligence and credit checks, financial stability and risks. I mean, we do see situations where agents are not necessarily in a great position financially, so that can be one to bear in mind. But I really think as well, it sounds really obvious, and in some ways it is, but just being really, really clear about what you want the agent to do, what the relationship should look like, and what performance is expected, what they're doing. You know, so you might have somebody who's got authority to conclude contracts, somebody who's just negotiating. There are other things as well, like things like the Bribery Act. You know, bearing in mind that, you know, your contracts need to cover stuff like that. People can behave differently in other countries. So just being really clear about the relationship, obviously put it in a contract if you can, and be as clear as possible.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
The question.
Quick question, if I may. This is Steve Lanier, and thanks, Roxanne. Very interesting information. We work in the U.S., and sometimes our clients have questions about which law should an agreement be governed under. In terms, you mentioned sort of UK law, US law. Sometimes we've heard if you govern by UK law and you have a dispute, and you actually get a a judgment against the U.S. agent, how do you enforce that? It can be a challenge, we've heard, to kind of enforce it. The agent might not even show up, so you get a judgment, but then it can take a long time, or it can be a challenge to actually enforce it. So sometimes we've heard, oh, it's better to have it under U.S. law, and you can do it in the U.S., and then it's easier to enforce. Any thoughts on the two, where to govern a potential agreement?
I mean, it's a nightmare, frankly, and I express deep sympathy for anyone in that situation. And I've been involved in a couple of things where you've had US law and English law, and sometimes a lack of clarity about which law applies. I mean, really, you need to seek advice on that. There's a whole minefield around enforcing judgments, and the length of time it can even take to get a judgment in England and Wales before you start enforcing it, frankly, is a nightmare. I mean, I'm aware this isn't a great answer for you, but I think it depends on a case-by-case situation, really. And enforcing anyway depends on, have they got money to pay? There's a whole minefield really there. It's something you definitely would want to take further advice on.
Perfect, thank you.
Any further questions?
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi there, Deborah.
Hi there. I just wanted to understand, again, with regard to the US, so anything we negotiate in terms of an agreement, does that sort of replace the regulations that are just there, or do the regulations apply alongside the agreement? So what takes precedence if for example, we're being offered a 1 month notice period with no particular reason for doing it, as in we can give them 1 month notice, but that isn't what's in the regulations. Would there still be a reason for them to perhaps be able to say, actually, now we're at 3 years, it should be 3 months, or because we've agreed 1 month at the beginning? That's the sort of thing.
Well, I'm not quite sure of the specific situation you're in. If you're in the US, are you contracting under English law, are you?
Well, we're a UK company looking to use looking to use a US, potentially use a US agent, and in the agreement that we've been sent, it would be under US law.
Yeah, I think if it's US law, it's different, and I can't really advise you, I'm afraid, on US law, the US position. You'd need to take specific advice, I think, on that agreement, and it would depend really on how that's set up. So I'd be nervous about sort of advising you. I mean, certainly if you wanted to ask for more advice later or more on the, I could do that, but I'd be nervous about saying without knowing what it is, I'm afraid. If it's but you'd certainly need US legal advice.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're going to give Roxanne's contact details. So if you do have specific questions for her, you can contact her directly. I'm just aware that we've run over slightly. Any more questions quickly before we round up? I think that's everything from the chat box as well. Yes, so like I said, I will send you the recording, Roxanne's slides, which have been brilliant, very detailed, and also Roxanne's contact details. And White and Black are our legal services service provider. So yeah, they are available for members to contact via the portal. They attend lots of our events, etc. So do connect with them if you have questions specifically regarding agreements and legal services. And yeah, so just finally, thank you, Roxanne, for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. I'm just going to do a very, very, very quick plug on the ticket sales are open for the FDA Export Network Forum and Export Awards on the 4th of December. If you haven't booked, please do go ahead and get your tickets. We've got some great speakers lined up. We've got IGD that will be doing global trend setting for up until 2030. So please do get your tickets for that. And we've got some case studies from Will Chase, founder of Tyrrell's and Willie's Apple Cider Vinegar. And we'll also be joined by Connor Love, who works for Partner Brands, who has represented Little Means, Trip, and Innocent. So 2 great case studies lined up, as well as a whole day of networking, exporter roundtables, and also we'll be presenting the winners of the FDA Export Awards. So go onto the member portal and book your tickets there. So that's it from me. Thank you again, Roxanne. Thank you very much for the webinar this morning. And thanks for everybody for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.